Introduce the grandma as someone who seemed warm, loving, and ordinary on the outside. Highlight how her story remained hidden for decades, even from close family. I want to tell you a story today. True story. One that begins not with violence or darkness, but with a quiet smile. You see, when you looked at her, this grandma with soft hands and kind eyes, you wouldn't have guessed the kind of pain she carried. She laughed when the grandkids were around, always humming in the kitchen, making tea, folding laundry like it was a small ritual of love. She was the type of person who remembered your birthday, who knitted scarves for the winter and told you not to go outside with wet hair. On the surface, she was ordinary. But pain has a way of nesting in ordinary people and hiding in plain sight. She never spoke much about her childhood. When she did, it was always vague. Times were different back then, she'd say, or your grandfather was strict. That was all. We didn't think to ask more. Why would we? We had no idea that behind her calm, measured voice was a story buried under years of silence. I remember sitting across from her one day while she was slicing apples for a pie. Her hands were shaking. I thought it was age, maybe just fatigue. But then she looked up at me and said, "You know, people forget what little girls carry when no one's looking." I didn't know what she meant then. I just smiled, not realizing she had just offered me a piece of the truth she'd been keeping locked away. Looking back, I wonder how many signs we missed. How many times her sudden quietness in the middle of a conversation was actually a wave of memory crashing into her chest. How many times her need for everything to be perfectly clean, perfectly in place, wasn't about pride, but about control in a world that once gave her none. This is the part that breaks me. That someone could live their whole life, loving others so deeply, while carrying such a wound. And yet she did. She carried it with grace. Not because it didn't hurt anymore, but because she chose to protect others from the pain she knew too well. And I think that's why she became the woman she did. Why she showed up to every school play, every hospital visit, every phone call at midnight. 'Cause no one showed up for her. Not when she needed it. You see, it's easy to judge a story once you know the end. But before we get to the moment of rescue or the road to healing, we have to sit with this part. The quiet part. The years where she learned how to smile while in pain. Where she learned how to pretend. She didn't cry in front of us. Not once. Not until she told me the truth. And even then it wasn't loud. It was a whisper. One evening, sitting by the window, her voice barely above the hum of the wind outside, she said, "He wasn't supposed to hurt me. He was my father." Just like that. No drama. No build-up. Just a fact she had carried for over 60 years. And I felt something shift in the room, like time paused to honor her courage. That was the first time I realized how much strength it takes to simply survive. To wake up, day after day, and still offer love to a world that once treated you like nothing. She had survived something unspeakable, and yet never let it poison the love she gave to us. That's not just resilience. That's a kind of quiet heroism most people never notice. And maybe that's why I'm standing here now, telling her story. Because the truth doesn't just live in the loud moments. It lives in the silences, the glances, the broken places that were stitched back together over years of pretending everything was fine. It lives in the way she held our hands a little tighter when we were scared, the way she never raised her voice, the way she always listened before she spoke. People always say survivors are brave when they speak up. And they are. But let's not forget the bravery it takes to live every day before that moment. To be kind when the world was cruel. To build a family when yours was broken. To bake a pie and hum a tune when your childhood was stolen. That's the kind of bravery my grandma had. And if all you ever knew was the sweet old woman who remembered everyone's favorite dessert, you might never imagine the war she had survived within herself. But I think that's the point. The strongest people often don't look like warriors. They look like grandmothers with trembling hands, whispering truths into the wind. She was never just a grandma. She was a survivor. It started the way so many betrayals do. Quietly. No warning, no flashing red lights. Just a small shift in the air, like something had changed, but you couldn't name it yet. She was just a little girl. Maybe 7, maybe 8. At that age, your world is small. Your parents are the center of it. You trust them without question. You believe what they say. You believe they love you. And that belief, that's what makes what happened so cruel. She remembered the first time it happened. Not the worst time, just the first. She had a headache. Her father told her to lie down, that he'd take care of it. He brought her something to drink. She didn't question it. Why would she? She drank it. Her memory after that was blurry, floating, disoriented, like her body didn't quite belong to her anymore. The room spun. Everything felt wrong, but she didn't have the words yet to explain how. And that became the pattern. She would feel dizzy, tired. She would wake up in different clothes. Sometimes there were bruises, but kids fall down, don't they? That's what he told her. You must have bumped into something. You're always so clumsy. And she believed it. Because the alternative, that was unthinkable. But as the days passed, she started to feel it in her bones. Something wasn't right. She would hear the door creak open when the house was quiet. She would feel his breath near her ear. His touch was wrong, but she didn't know what wrong meant yet. No one had told her what to be afraid of, only to be a good girl and listen to her parents. And so she did. He made her feel like it was her fault. That's the part she never forgot. The way he twisted it into something shameful, her shame, not his. He'd say things like, "Don't tell your mother. She wouldn't understand." Or, "This is our secret." He smiled when he said that. And when you're a child, you think secrets are something special, something magical. Until they turn into cages. She stopped playing with her dolls. She stopped asking questions. Something inside her was folding in on itself, curling up to hide. And still no one saw it. No one noticed how she flinched when he came near. How her laughter faded into silence. She was disappearing in front of everyone, and no one asked why. But the hardest part, the part that stayed with her long after the bruises faded, was that it was her father. The man who taught her to ride a bike. The man who tucked her in at night. How do you reconcile that? How do you look at someone who is supposed to protect you and see the person who betrayed you in the most horrific way? He used that trust like a weapon. He poisoned it slowly over time, until she didn't know what was real anymore. Was she imagining it? Was she being dramatic? Maybe she was just dreaming. That's what he said too. You're just dreaming. But dreams don't leave fingerprints. Dreams don't leave you waking up crying, feeling dirty, feeling afraid to close your eyes at night. She began to detach from herself. It was a defense mechanism, though she didn't know the word for it. She learned how to float above it. How to pretend. How to be somewhere else, even if her body was still there. And it worked in a way. Kept her alive. But it also stole something from her. Her innocence. Her ability to trust. Her sense of safety in the world. Even now, decades later, she still doesn't like to be touched unexpectedly. Still keeps a nightlight on when she sleeps. Still has dreams where she can't move, can't scream, can't breathe. That's what trauma does. It embeds itself in your body. And it doesn't care how much time has passed. It waits, quietly, just beneath the surface. She never hated him. Not the way people think she should. What she felt was more complicated than that. It was grief. Grief for the father she thought she had. Grief for the childhood she lost. Grief for the girl who used to believe she was safe. And yet she didn't break. That's what amazes me. She carried that betrayal, that horror, for years before anyone knew. And she still grew into someone who could love, who could raise children, who could sit on a porch swing and tell stories to her grandchildren without letting the bitterness win. But the truth is, there's a moment in every survivor's life when they realize the person they trusted most was the one who hurt them the deepest. And when that realization comes, it doesn't just crack you open, it changes your very sense of reality. And for her, that moment wasn't loud. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet heartbreak that never quite healed. There are some things no child should ever have to endure, things so far outside the bounds of what's fair or human that just speaking them aloud feels like a betrayal of innocence itself. And yet she lived through them. She didn't read about it or hear it secondhand. She lived it. That same little girl with the soft braids and the chipped tooth from falling off her bike. That girl was slowly pulled into a nightmare, one that didn't end when she woke up. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the act itself, the abuse. Not hinted at, not vague, not some shadowy presence around the edges of her life. It was real. It was in her room, in her bed, in her body. The kind of thing that fractures your sense of self, not all at once but in pieces. Every time it happened, a little more of her disappeared. She was so small, so utterly unprepared for what he took from her. She would lie there, motionless, trying not to breathe too loudly, as if stillness could protect her. As if she didn't move, maybe he'd stop. Maybe he'd forget. But he never did. He knew exactly what he was doing. And that might be the most horrifying part, he chose to do it. Again and again. Sometimes she'd try to stay awake as long as she could, dreading the sound of his footsteps. She would count the seconds between floorboards creaking. Sometimes she'd even pray. Not for herself, but that he wouldn't come that night. That he'd fall asleep. That maybe God would be watching and make him stop. But it didn't stop. And when the drugging began, she lost even the small power of awareness. Her body became something detached, like an object passed between nightmares. She'd wake up sore, confused, sometimes in clothes that weren't hers, sometimes not in clothes at all. She couldn't make sense of it, not entirely, but the ache, the terror, the disgust, they were there. And they didn't need a name to feel real. She didn't even know it was abuse at first. How could she? No one had told her what to expect, what was right or wrong when it came to things like that. All she knew was that it felt bad, and that her father told her not to speak. And that was enough to make her stay silent. Shame settles in quickly when you're that young. You start to believe maybe you did do something wrong. Maybe you deserved it. He would tell her it was love, that it was special, that he was teaching her something. And that sick kind of language, the grooming, the manipulation, it twisted her young mind into knots. He blurred every boundary, confused every instinct, until up felt like down and pain felt like something she should be grateful for. There were days she wanted to scream, to run. But where would she go? What would she say? She had no words for what was happening. No sense that someone would believe her. And when the person hurting you is someone the whole world sees as good and decent, your silence becomes your only protection. Because if you say it out loud and no one believes you, then you're not just hurt. You're alone. So she kept quiet. She kept pretending. School, she smiled. At the dinner table, she passed the salt. She learned to laugh when she needed to hide the bruises, to bury the nightmares so deep she could almost convince herself they weren't real. But they were. They were real. And even years later, she couldn't shake it. She could still feel the imprint of his hands. Still hear the way he whispered her name like it was something to be ashamed of. It haunted her, not just in her dreams, but in the way she flinched when someone stood too close. In the way she always sat with her back to the wall. In the way she could never quite look at a father and daughter in a park without her chest tightening. She didn't just survive abuse. She survived being trapped in her own body while the world moved on like nothing had happened. That's a particular kind of hell, one that doesn't leave scars on the outside. People think if you can't see it, it must not be that bad. But some wounds go bone deep. They live in your nervous system, in your breath, in your silence. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't even the pain. It was that no one noticed. That she could be used over and over again, and still be expected to finish her homework, to brush her teeth, to smile for the school photo. That's the cruelty of it. That a child can be shattered nightly and still show up in the morning like nothing happened. But it did happen. And she remembered every detail. Not because she wanted to, but because her body never forgot. There's always a moment, sometimes small, sometimes seismic, when the truth finally comes to the surface. For her, it came late one night, in the stillness of the house, when the world outside was sleeping and everything inside was holding its breath. That night changed everything. Not because the abuse stopped on its own, or because someone finally asked the right question, but because her mother finally heard. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a dramatic cry for help. It was just a sound, a soft, muffled noise from the other room. But something about it was different. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the quiet desperation in it. Whatever it was, her mother didn't brush it off like all the other nights. She got up. She listened. She followed that sound down the hallway, barefoot, unsure of what she was walking into. But she knew something was wrong. Mothers always know, even if they don't want to admit it. She opened the door. And what she saw, what she knew in that instant, shattered her. There was no more pretending. No more looking away. No more, maybe she's just having nightmares, or, your father would never. In that moment, the truth poured in like cold water. Her husband, the man she built a life with, was hurting their daughter. And not in some vague emotional way, but in a brutal, unspeakable one. I don't know what's harder, being the child living through it, or being the mother who realizes too late that she didn't see it happening. But that night everything stopped. The illusion broke. The family she thought she had collapsed in on itself. And she had a choice to make. One that no one should ever have to make, but one that defined the rest of their lives. She chose her daughter. He screamed. She pulled him off. She locked the door. She wrapped her daughter in a blanket and held her as if she could somehow undo all the nights that had come before. But of course she couldn't. The damage was done. Still, in that moment she did the one thing that finally made the nightmare end. She saw her. She believed her. And that belief, that split-second decision to protect rather than deny, saved her daughter's life. The aftermath was chaos. There were police questions, shame hanging in the air like smoke. The neighbors whispered. Some didn't want to believe it. But none of that mattered. Because she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone stood between her and him. It was strange. How quickly the house changed. The silence was heavier. The rooms felt colder. He was gone, but the echo of what he did still lingered. Her mother tried to be strong, to hold everything together, but you could see the guilt in her eyes. You could see the way she looked at her daughter, as if trying to measure the weight of the damage and wondering if love alone could fix it. They never spoke much about that night in detail. There was too much pain around it, too many pieces no one knew how to say out loud. But they both remembered it. Every second, the creak of the door, the way the light from the hallway fell across the bed, the breath caught in her mother's throat when she saw what was happening. That moment, frozen in time, became the line between before and after. She didn't heal overnight. Of course she didn't. There's no magic switch, no final chapter that makes it all better. But the moment someone sees you, when someone finally hears you, that's when healing begins. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't rewrite what happened. But it gives you the strength to take the next breath. To get out of bed. To speak, eventually, without shaking. And what's remarkable is that she never blamed her mother. Not once. Even though she'd lived through years of silence, years of wondering why no one noticed, she knew the moment her mother found out, she chose her. She defended her. She believed her without needing proof. And that belief, that act of protection, it meant everything. She told me that the hardest thing wasn't surviving the abuse. It was surviving the silence. Living in a world where no one seemed to notice the fear in her eyes, the tremble in her hands, the way she tried to disappear in plain sight. But that silence was broken the night her mother heard her. Really heard her. And after that, things didn't magically get better. But they started to move. She started to speak slowly. She started to feel, even when it hurt. Because now she had someone standing beside her. And that made all the difference. Sometimes it only takes one person to hear something the rest of the world has been ignoring. After that night, everything changed. But not in the neat, hopeful way stories sometimes like to pretend. The truth had finally come out, yes. The secret was exposed. But what followed wasn't relief. It was chaos. Pain didn't just disappear once it was spoken aloud. If anything, it grew louder. More tangled. More complicated. The truth had opened the door. But walking through it, surviving what came after, that was its own battle. She was just a child, standing in the wreckage of what used to be her home, trying to understand what came next. Her father was gone. Her mother was different now. Present, yes, but also hollowed out with guilt and grief. And she She was broken in ways she didn't even understand yet. Everyone kept saying she was brave, that she was strong for telling the truth, for surviving. But inside she didn't feel brave. She felt used up. Like a story people had read too many times and now wanted to skip past. There were social workers, therapists, words like case file and court date, thrown around in conversations she didn't understand. She'd sit in rooms with strangers asking her to explain the worst parts of her life, again and again, like repeating it would somehow help. But it didn't feel helpful. It felt like bleeding in public. And even when people were kind, there was still that look in their eyes, the one that said, "Poor girl." The one that made her feel like she would always be that girl. The damaged one. Healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't even a line at all. It was more like a spiral. Days where she felt like maybe she could breathe again, followed by nights where the darkness came rushing back in. She had panic attacks, nightmares, a deep, aching distrust of touch. It took years before she could fall asleep without the light on. Years before she could walk into a room without checking every corner, every door, just to make sure she was safe. But there was progress, even if it came in small, quiet steps. Like the first time she made eye contact with someone new and didn't flinch. Or the first time she spoke about what happened without her voice cracking. Or the first time she looked in the mirror and didn't feel ashamed of the body that had been used and violated. Those moments mattered. They weren't loud. They weren't celebrated. But they were hers. She never pretended it didn't happen. That wasn't healing. Healing for her was learning to live with what happened, without letting it define every inch of who she was. It meant facing the grief, the rage, the guilt she didn't deserve to carry. It meant forgiving herself for things she didn't even need forgiveness for. For freezing. For not fighting back. For not telling someone sooner. That's what abuse does. It rewires you to feel responsible for your own suffering. And undoing that took time. But she did it. Little by little, she pieced herself back together. Not into the person she was before. That person was gone. But into someone new. Someone strong. Someone who had walked through hell and was still standing. And her mother, though haunted by her own guilt, stood beside her through it. She never left again. She went to every appointment, sat through every difficult conversation, listened when her daughter needed to scream or cry or sit in silence. And that mattered. Because healing doesn't happen alone. It happens in safe spaces, with people who refuse to let you drown in your own pain. The thing is, people often ask how someone recovers from something like that. But recovery isn't a destination. It's a process. And sometimes it looks like crying in the shower. Sometimes it looks like going a whole day without remembering. Sometimes it's laughing and feeling joy and then feeling guilty for having joy. It's messy, slow, but it's possible. She grew into a woman who didn't hide from her story. She told it, not all at once but when it mattered. She used it to help others, to let them know they weren't alone. Because she remembered what it felt like to believe you were the only one. And more than anything, she wanted to be the voice she never had. The one that says, I believe you. It wasn't your fault. You are not what was done to you, The scars never went away. But they softened. They became part of her, not the whole of her. She still had hard days, but they didn't own her. She made a life, a real, full life. She built relationships that weren't rooted in fear. She created safety where there had once been only danger. And most importantly, she forgave herself for surviving. Because survival is not a weakness. It's a strength. Quiet, stubborn, unshakable strength. People often think that the hardest part of surviving something traumatic is the pain itself. The nights full of fear, the memories that won't stay buried, the silence you carried for years. And yes, all of that is brutal. But what no one really prepares you for is what comes after. The part where you're expected to re-enter the world like nothing happened. To function, to smile, to build something new on the ruins of what was taken from you. That's where the real fight begins. For her, healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about reclaiming. Reclaiming her body, her voice, her right to exist without shame. And it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. Truly living. And that came slowly over time, in moments that didn't look extraordinary on the outside, but were everything to her. Like the first time she laughed from deep in her belly again. Real laughter, not polite, not forced. It caught her off guard and she cried afterward, not because she was sad, but because for a second joy had broken through. Or the time she stood in front of a mirror and said, "I deserve love," and actually believed it. Not just said it to convince herself. She believed it. That was a milestone no one else saw, but it was as important as any court verdict or therapy session. She built a life. Slowly, patiently. One that didn't revolve around fear. She took her pain and turned it into something useful, not as a way to glorify the suffering, but as proof that something beautiful can grow even in the darkest places. She volunteered. She mentored other young girls who had faced the same kind of horror. And not once did she pretend to be a hero. She simply showed up. And sometimes, that's more powerful than any grand gesture. She married eventually. Carefully. Intentionally. She didn't rush trust. It was earned layer by layer. And the man she chose. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't flinch at her story. He stood by her with quiet strength, letting her be messy, letting her be scared, letting her be real. That kind of love. The kind that's patient, that doesn't demand perfection, that understands where you've been, it's rare. And she didn't take it for granted. But even more than the love she found, it was the love she gave herself that marked her true freedom. For years she hated herself. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because that's what trauma does. It convinces you that you're unworthy. But she challenged that lie. Day after day. She showed up for herself. Fed herself. Rested when she needed to. Said no when something didn't feel right. Those might sound like small things, but for a survivor, those are acts of revolution. And she told her story. Not always in rooms like this. Sometimes just to one person, quietly. Sometimes through writing. Sometimes through silence that carried more truth than any words. But she told it. Because her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every little girl who had been hurt and silenced and made to feel invisible. She carried them with her. Every time she stood up. Every time she said, "I lived through this and I'm still here." That's what survival looks like. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it limps. But it keeps going. And that's what she did. She became a grandmother one day. That same little girl who once lay terrified in the dark, now tucking in her grandkids at night, reading them stories, singing softly until their eyes fluttered closed. She created a home where no one had to be afraid, where bedtime meant safety, not silence. And in doing that, she rewrote the future. She didn't pass down the pain. She ended it. And no, she never forgot. Some wounds stay with you. Some ghosts never fully leave. But they didn't control her anymore. They didn't define her. What defined her was her strength, her love, her refusal to let what was done to her be the end of her story. So when people ask how she did it, how she went from victim to survivor to healer, the answer is this. She chose to keep going. Even when it hurt. Even when it was hard. Even when the world told her to be quiet, to move on, to forget. She didn't forget. She fought. And she won. That is what power looks like.